Jesus said, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven." This week we continue with our readings from the 6th chapter of the Gospel according to John, the section of the Gospel that Scripture scholars call the Bread of Life Discourse. One day, years ago, a priest walked into a church in Germany. As he knelt there, his attention was drawn to the large bronze tabernacle door. It was divided into 4 panels. We call it a triptych. The first panel showed 6 water jars, symbolizing the miracle at Cana when Jesus changed water into wine. The second panel showed 5 loaves, symbolizing the miracle at Capernaum when Jesus multiplied the bread for the hungry crowd on the hillside. The third panel showed 13 people at table, symbolizing the miracle at Jerusalem when Jesus transformed bread and wine into his own body and blood. The fourth showed 3 people at table, symbolizing the miracle at Emmaus when Jesus manifested his risen presence on Easter night to those 2 downcast and grieving disciples. The artist picked these 4 miracles for the tabernacle door because they told the beautiful story of the Eucharist housed inside that tabernacle. Take the first panel, the miracle at Cana. Now, some 21st century Christians find this miracle a stumbling block. The important thing, however, is not how Jesus worked the miracle at Cana, but why he worked it. Besides saving the young married couple from social embarrassment, Jesus did it to prepare people for the day when he would change the same wine into the sacrament of his own blood. However, most first century Christians lived off the soil and saw a similar miracle take place annually before their very eyes. Each summer, grapevines drew water from the soil, changed it into grape juice, and then later on fermented into wine. Next, take the miracle of the loaves, which led to the discussion in today's gospel reading. Once again, the important thing is not how Jesus worked this miracle, but why. Besides feeding a hungry crowd, Jesus also used it to prepare the same hungry crowd for the day when he would feed them in an even more marvelous way, in a spiritual way. But again, most first century Christians had no problems with it at all. As with miracle of the wine, they saw a similar miracle take place each year in their wheat fields. In the spring, the farmers planted a few bushels of wheat, and in the course of the summer, nature multiplied the few bushels into 100-fold bushels of golden wheat. That brings us to the third panel, depicting the Last Supper. At that moment, Jesus gave us a gift that only God could give, and it leads us directly to the last panel, the Emmaus Supper on Easter night with those 2 disciples. Recall how they were walking along when Jesus appeared to them as a stranger and explained the Scriptures to them. When they arrived home in Emmaus, they invited Jesus to eat with them. The artist interprets the Emmaus Supper as the first celebration of the Eucharist sacramentally. And so the tabernacle door summarizes the 4 stages in Jesus' gift of the Eucharist. It was prefigured in the marriage feast at Cana, promised on the hillside at Capernaum, instituted at the Last Supper in Jerusalem, and celebrated at Emmaus. This brings us to how the Eucharist touches our lives. First, it is a spiritual nourishment, just as the manna we heard about the other week nourished the Israelites on their journey to the Promised Land. So the Eucharist nourishes us on our journey to our Promised Land. We call it heaven. Second, besides nourishing us on a journey, it also makes present sacramentally the real presence of Jesus in our midst. Recall that before Jesus ascended to heaven, he made this promise: I will be with you always, even until the end of the age. Let me close with a little story. Father Joseph Hogan was a chaplain in Europe with the U.S. Third Army during the Second World War. One Sunday, he felt the impact of what I've been talking about, this twofold gift of the Eucharist, in a way that he had never experienced it before. He writes, I was celebrating Mass on top of a Jeep on a battlefield in France. The men were attending with helmets on and their guns slung over their shoulders. The yak-yak was pecking at the plains above, and a torrent of rain was falling. The battlefield was a sea of mud. So I told the men not to kneel down. They didn't until the Eucharistic prayer. Then every man went down on his knees into the mud and the mud puddles. Minutes later, when they slogged up to receive Holy Communion, they again knelt in the mud puddles. End of quote. It was an incredible manifestation of their faith in the real presence of Jesus. He was present in a twofold way, with them as their support and for them as a nourishment in this awful hour of human misery. It was their way of declaring who it was they were receiving. It was the same Jesus who changed the water into wine at Cana, prefiguring the Eucharist. It was the same Jesus who multiplied the loaves at Capernaum as a promise of the Eucharist. It was the same Jesus who changed bread and wine into his own body and blood at the Last Supper, instituting the Eucharist. And it was the same Jesus who celebrated the first Eucharist at Emmaus after its institution. It is this incredible gift that we return to the altar to celebrate. It staggers our imagination, but we know by faith that it is true. Only an incredible person like Jesus could have conceived of and given us such an incredible gift. In the words of St. Augustine of Hippo, receive who you are, become who you receive.